Thank you very much. I think we'll get started. There might still be people trickling in. I'm just serving a purpose of brief reminder, just to check that cell phones are turned off, brief housekeeping matter, and to welcome you to our panel, Arab World Transitions, the Impact on the Arab-Israeli Conflict and Prospects for Peace. As you can see, we have an incredible lineup of panelists to discuss this issue. We're very pleased to have an incredible moderator to guide the discussion. We have Kate Seeley with us, who's the Vice President of the Middle East Institute and a former radio and television journalist who for many years covered the Arab world. So without further ado, I know there's a lot of ground to cover and a lot of people to cover it. I'd like to hand over to Kate and our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and I want to thank our hosts, USIP and the Baker Institute, for putting together such an important conference at this historic juncture in time. My only complaint is that the title, 20 Years After Madrid, makes me a little sad because I remember all the incredible optimism I felt 20 years ago when the Madrid peace talks were launched. There's so much in transition in the Middle East today, and yet there seems to be one constant, and that is the lack of progress in the peace process. But we're gathered here today because there are new regional dynamics at work that are expected to affect the peace process. There are new political forces emerging in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, possibly Syria. We're seeing U.S. influence on the wane as a result of these emerging democratic movements and the rise of Turkish influence, and all of that is expected to lead to new and surprising developments. Will these new developments lead to a break in the stalemate in the peace process? Will it lead to new opportunities or new tensions and dangers? Those are the issues we'll be discussing today with this stellar group that we have assembled before you. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. You have their full bios in your programs. We're going to begin with Dan Brumberg, who is a senior program officer at the Center for Conflict Management at USIP and an expert on democratization and political reform in the wider Islamic world. Graham Bannerman is a scholar at the Middle East Institute, a former Mideast analyst on the U.S. State Department policy planning staff, and an expert on Middle East and Egyptian politics. Yair Hirschfield is the creator and a key architect of the Oslo track of negotiations and joined the Israeli negotiating team when the track became official in 1993. He is now with the Economic Cooperation Foundation, which is based in Tel Aviv. Nadia Lubesi Charters is the chief news correspondent for the Washington Bureau of the Middle East Broadcasting Center. She has over 20 years of experience as a foreign correspondent covering events in the Arab world. And last but not least, Robert Satloff is the executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's published widely on Arab and Islamic politics and the peace process. Thank you all so much for joining us today. May I have permission to call everybody by their first name? Thank you very much. We're going to go through a round of questions and then open the panel to questions from the audience. And I want to begin with Dan, who's been following the Arab Spring quite closely in his work here at USIP. And I've asked him to sort of set the mood in the Middle East vis-a-vis the peace process now. I think what struck many of us watching the uprisings in Tahrir Square was the fact that there was so little condemnation of Israel, the United States, and the stalemate in the peace process. Protesters were really focused on reform issues. And so my question to you, Dan, is as Arabs have been preparing for elections in Tunisia and Egypt, hopefully in Libya, I'd like you to talk about how much the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been part of the election discourse. And if you think for Arabs now in general who are concerned about putting in place new governments, if this issue still resonates, is it still a core issue?
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to be here. And I have a few short minutes to share some complex ideas with you. And I can't go into all the things I wanted to say, but by way of a quick answer to your question, it seems to me that in the short term, the juxtaposition of the peace process and the series of rebellions that are called the Arab Spring, which I prefer to think of as democratic rebellions of some kind, are probably going to complicate the peace process, which is hardly a process right now, but they in many ways are going to perhaps make it somewhat more difficult, and certainly from the perspective of the Israelis, increase the perception of risk attached to making concessions for peace. In the long term, I'm more optimistic because I think that ultimately what we've had is a legacy, and the juxtaposition in the peace process between peacemaking and dictators has not been a good thing for the region. Essentially, you had a set of agreements that were struck by political leaders who did not have much in the way of constraints in terms of public opinion. And the result of that was, and we saw that in Egypt, and that was repeated elsewhere in Jordan as well, of course, is that in the public mind, certainly among the elites who do matter, peacemaking and despotism were somehow equated in ways that were very unhelpful and very much complicated the whole role of democratization and in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I think we have that legacy to recognize, and I think that to the extent that the Arab Spring over the long term, in some but not all cases, will provide democratically elected leaders who will be responsible for their actions. We're going to see public opinion playing an important constricting role or constraining a role, but at the same time we'll see foreign policies that have a degree of legitimacy that they didn't have before. And this conflation of the peacemaking process with local autocracies, which is inevitable, perhaps will be sorted out. Whether for the better or for the worse, I can't say. Ultimately, we have two factors that really loom large in terms of answering your question. One is the local conditions and forces, the nature of the authoritarian regimes that set the background for the Arab Spring, and the proximity to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I was in Tunisia recently, and it has to be said, there where, Tunisia is the good story. There, one hardly had a peep, including from the Islamists, about the Arab-Israeli conflict. From Nahda, it's important on an emotional level, it's important on a symbolic, ideological level, but it doesn't figure as a centerpiece of the peacemaking process, and that is part because Tunisia is a long way off, because we have the French to thank too. The Islamists really dislike the French more so than anybody else, and they see the Americans as a possible counterbalance. So it's a very different set of conditions there in that sense. The Tunisian process is also highly unstructured. You don't have a military, as you do in Egypt, that is really framing and manipulating the political field in ways that I think in the case of Egypt invite efforts to manipulate the Arab-Israeli conflict for reasons of establishing kind of nationalist credentials and for reasons of trying to deflect pressures both at home and abroad on the government itself of Egypt. I think it's been quite systematic in trying to sort of play the nationalist Palestinian, Arab-Israeli kinds of issues in ways designed to continue the fragmentation of the opposition. So those are very two different dynamics, and they have to do with the local conditions, the nature of the authoritarian state from which the transition is being made, and of course the proximity to the conflict. Egypt and Jordan will be seen much more tied to that conflict. I think the dynamic is different in Yemen. I think it's different in Libya. I think it's different in Tunisia the further away you get, and will be if it ever happens. We have a full-scale uprising in Morocco. Will be different in that sense too. I finally would only add this point, and that is we did a series of studies at USIP in conjunction with Georgetown University some years back, and we looked at the dynamics of opposition alliance making, and it was always clear that in terms of the efforts of opposition forces to address the challenge of authoritarianism, that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict played a role in providing a basis for unity around that conflict in the absence of any consensus on democratization. The Arab state was what I call a protection racket state, which offered protection to specific groups, particularly secular groups, certainly in the case of North Africa, and used and manipulated the fears between secularists and Islamists to keep the opposition off guard. And to the extent that opposition groups were able to overcome that sort of manipulative game and create an alliance based on a strategic vision of democracy, they had some hope of addressing the whole logic of authoritarianism in the region. But often that sort of goal was obscured by the ephemeral kind of unity that oppositions could create around the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and that obscured the question, the challenge of building effective democratic institutions and effective political alliances in favor of democracy. The Arab Spring was not a planned event, obviously. It surprised regimes, but it also surprised oppositions. And as a consequence of that, we have a process which is being improvised throughout the region in ways that are challenging oppositions as well. To the extent that they can focus on the process of democratization, the better. To the extent that their efforts are either manipulated or dragged under by the Arab-Israeli conflict, that's going to affect the prospects for democratization in those countries. This doesn't mean, by the way, and I'll conclude on this note, that this is simply a manipulative game being played by regimes. The Arab-Israeli conflict on a basic level is a key issue for Arabs throughout the region, for Muslims throughout the world. They feel strongly about it. But it's only in moments of crisis in that conflict where it becomes, particularly in the further away countries such as Tunisia, an issue of mobilization. We will see that play out if there is a complete breakdown of the conflict and, I'd say, another round of violence between the Palestinians and Israelis in Gaza. But in the absence of that, I think you're going to find that the local conditions are the predominant ones, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not going to play the kind of major role in those conflicts we would otherwise assume.
So, thank you. Not as central in North Africa, but Graham, clearly in Egypt, it's still a highly emotional issue. We should note here that many Egyptians have long been quite ambivalent about Egypt's peace treaty with Israel, I would argue. And lately we've been seeing some alarming signs coming out of Egypt, the attack on the Israeli embassy, presidential candidates calling for a reassessment of the peace treaty with Israel. The Muslim Brotherhood is expected to do quite well in elections. They have long opposed the treaty, although I realize their position is a little bit different today. How at risk is the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty in this new environment? And what is at stake if, in fact, in a new Egyptian government, there was a call for a reassessment of it?
Well, I don't think the peace treaty is in jeopardy with whatever change is going on. I think Egypt is going through a real revolution. There's fundamental changes going on. There's a process. It's organized and it's disorganized at the same time. But I think with the people in the square and the military all agreed last February on four things. They agreed that President Mubarak had to go. They agreed that the police were brutal and they suppressed the population that had to change. They believed that the rich... I did myself. My fight was off, incompetence. But anyhow, they believed that we don't agree. The rich crony capitalists were harming society, and they also believed that you needed to open society up to the democratic process. All of those things are in the process of occurring. But that's about what they agreed on. There was not much talk about the peace treaty. There was not much talk about the relationship. I can't get this thing off.
I can turn it off for you.
It's Tantawi. Graham, it's General Tantawi.
Actually, it's more important. It's my wife. No, but actually, I apologize. But anyhow, and so what you had this transition occurring, and this was not the foremost concern of any of the Egyptians on any side. It's important to Egypt, but it's not essential. But I think there's no one who can say that when you have the transition, certain changes are going to happen in Egyptian society that are going to fundamentally alter the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, the Egyptian-U.S. relationship. As you bring the people of Egypt into the decision-making process and you reflect the views more, that will create a different policy in Egypt. Because one of the complaints about President Mubarak was he was too close to the Americans. He took orders from the Americans. He followed the Americans too much. He gave in to the Israelis too much. So therefore, you have in this revolution also a very nationalistic feeling.
Sure. So how do you see the Egyptian-Israeli relationship changing?
Well, let's take the example of the incidents. When we talk about the attack upon the Israeli embassy, you have to put that into context. That occurred after the Israelis killed 6 Egyptian border police crossing the border into Egypt on this attack. Therefore, it was a nationalistic response to that incident. you're going to see the Egyptians much less willing to put up with things that occurred in the past. There were incidents in the past where border police were killed by Israelis bombing, particularly along Rafah. In those cases, the Egyptian government was able to dampen it down. That will never happen again. These are going to be real incidents. So what you're going to see from the Egyptians is a more stand up for Egyptian nationalism. I mean, that's the one thing that unites the Egyptians across the spectrum. If they're a Muslim brother, or if they're secularist, or if they're the military, they are nationalism, and Egyptian nationalism will come very strong in the future. I think what's important about Egypt is that Egypt, like Lebanon, were the only two countries that regularly in all surveys are nationalistic about their local country, more than being Muslim or more than being Arab nationalist. They care about Egypt. And therefore, you're going to see whoever emerges as it's being very nationalistic.
But Amr Moussa, if you were to become president, has said he wants to reassess the peace treaty after he becomes president or whomever.
I think
Cairo calls Jerusalem. What are they going to say?
I think there's no question that whoever becomes president will reassess the relationship. I mean, they are certainly discontent over certain aspects of the treaty. But, Amr Moussa, to be honest, was at Camp David when the peace treaty was agreed to, and he was a skeptic then. So why would you expect him to change after 30-some years? But that said, the overwhelming majority of Egyptians see a benefit of 35 years of peace versus 5 wars in the previous 25 years. And therefore, there seems to be little pressure at all on the military or on the government now to move away from that treaty. There's pressure to stand up and to be more forthcoming. But there's also benefits of what's occurring. I think if you saw the exchange of prisoners in Gaza, it was made possible because of the transition. Prior to the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood was seen as the enemy, and Hamas was seen as close to the Muslim Brotherhood. That impeded any chances of negotiation between the government of Egypt and the Hamas because they were seen as cohorts of the enemy. The new government now accepts everybody, I'm talking about the military council, as being Egyptian. They're not pro-Muslim Brotherhood. They're not pro-demonstrator. They're pro-Egyptian. And what they try to do is balance, during this transition period, all of the people who are in Egypt, and then they move forward. Therefore, they have a working relationship with everybody. To be honest, it's a lot easier for them to have a working relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood because they're organized. I mean, you can say, when you have to negotiate with a leaderless revolution, you don't know really who you're supposed to negotiate with. But the Brotherhood was organized, and you could talk to them. And therefore, they talked to them. They've worked very hard to find people on the other side. But we're in a transition. The period is going on. I think there's some frustration that's either going too fast for some and too slow for the others, but you're trying to balance this transition period. And I think the signs are they will make it, but it's going to be bumpy and it's going to be difficult.
I want to jump to Israel and Yair. From Egypt to Israel, from the perspective of Washington, the Israelis look increasingly isolated in the wake of the Arab Spring as some of their traditional alliances become a little more shaky, like the one with Egypt, arguably. I'd like you to address the impact of the region's changes on sort of official Israeli thinking about the peace process, about their relationship with Egypt. From here, Netanyahu looks as though he has his head in the sand while the region changes around him. How do they view these tectonic shifts? And I'd like to hear your perspective about whether you see the changes in the region as being an opportunity for Israel or really a crisis.
I'll try to give answers to those many questions.
Pick and choose.
And, obviously. So if I have to speak for Prime Minister Netanyahu, which is a peculiar proposition, he in his May 16th statement to the Knesset, he said first and foremost our Israeli interest is Israeli security, and second, maintaining the peace with Egypt and Jordan. It didn't come on second place. And he said something on Iran and the Palestinians in third place. And I would say, obviously, the developments in Syria are an opportunity. The developments in Syria are an opportunity. Syria has the potential of a game changer. If we speak about Syria, we can see that the only way to form a possibly united opposition against the Assad regime is to have the different forces on a civilian basis together, not on an ethnical basis. And this creates a certain Syrian legitimacy that can make it possible to move forward, and it changes, it undermines Iran, it undermines Hezbollah, it makes it interesting for Hamas, has to move in a different direction. So the Syrian development is an important development, and I think it would be extremely important to have discussions with the United States, with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, on how to coordinate policies on Syria. Obviously, the Israeli side should be as quiet as possible, possibly not seen, but Israel has a very vested interest. And if I say something about Syria, there are other dangers there. And the dangers is that they have weapons of mass destruction laying around and nobody knows who will put his hands on it. And this is a major issue that has to be taken care of if we don't have to major sacrifices. Let me say something about Egypt. I think the Egyptians, and I'm not sure if this is fully understood here in the United States, because I must say some of the American comments are quite peculiar. And I'm a professor of Middle Eastern history, and I'm not sure if it goes along with my disciplinary understanding. But the Egyptians will have to choose between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And in the moment, they're closer to the French Revolution and farther away from the American Revolution. And the French Revolution meant that there was a major revolution, there was a major change, but they needed a lot of heads to roll, and the guillotine was very active. And out of the guillotine came one war after the other. And to say that democracies only will bring about peace and love and things is something that is far away from truth. The American Revolution created a revolution where government was an important part of it, and not only elections or anything the like. And we obviously, what we have today, in the very short range, I must say in the very short range, I'm optimistic about Egypt.
You're optimistic?
Yes, in the very short range. I don't know further down the line. But in the very short range, the exchange of the Gilad Shalit thing has given enormous encouragement to the Egyptian leadership. They definitely want to maintain the peace treaty. I agree with it. They want to increase cooperation with Israel in many things, and some good things are happening on that level. I tell you where my big danger is, and I made a when I heard about the 6 Egyptian soldiers that were killed, and the was based, not that I should express myself in such a brilliant way, but the coup was built on that there had been an outrageous terror attack on Israeli territory and Eilat from Egyptian territory. The Israeli security forces know who of them were Egyptian soldiers and who were not. And if the game that is emerging from the Tahrir Square is that whenever Israel is attacked by terror and whenever Israel defends itself, this is a major attack against Egypt, then God help us. Because then it is a situation where there's no win situation, and whatever the goodwill may be on the Egyptian side, it may be not good enough. And the problem is not that there's not goodwill in Egypt, and the problem is not that there's not goodwill, that there's not an interest to look into the Egyptian situation, but the unbearable lightness, the unbearable easiness of moving into a confrontational situation is very, very dangerous under conditions where Sinai is becoming more and more not a no man's land, but a land where they don't have full control, and under conditions where the Egyptian army is very careful to take action that is not popular. So it is a very, very, very volatile situation. We have had enormous constructive American activities in building Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation. There is strong Israeli-Egyptian security cooperation, but it must be nourished and it must be supported. There are many things that can be done, but one has to work on the wider frame of it. And I believe that it creates a lot of challenges that we have to live up to.
Just briefly to follow up, why do you think a majority-ruled Syria, a non-Alawite Syria, would be more likely to make peace with Israel?
I'm sure they would likely make more peace with Israel. The question is Israel is likely to make peace with them, to give up the Golan Heights. And at the present stage, the issue is not the Golan Heights. At the present stage, the issue is movement on the Palestinian front. The Palestinians have suggested something where Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, the Gulf Cooperation Council will come in. I believe this is feasible, this is doable. Also, we'll have to they come. And then it's fine if you take care of Syria slowly, they move ahead and they come in a third and fourth place. And then it's fine. I think this is something that is manageable.
Well, Nadia, moving on to the Palestinian issue, of course, you've covered the Palestinian issue, you've lived in Gaza. Very briefly, what impact did the Arab Spring have on sort of Palestinian perceptions in the territories? We did not see any protests. Of course, the West Bank and Gaza experienced the first free and fair elections in the Middle East in 2006. And also, what impact do you think the changes in the region had on President Abbas's thinking about an approach to the peace process?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for coming. I don't know why people don't like to sit in the front. I mean, we're a friendly audience, and you don't have to ask a question. I was in a panel before I came here, and one of the people who asked this question, she's talking about this process that went on for 20 years, and she looked around and she said, I see the usual suspects here. And I wanted to see more of women. I want to see maybe human rights activists or civil society involved, etc. And she said, it's only a few women here, which is true, and maybe they're the token one. So I hope I'm not your token one today. But I agree with her, and I take the point, actually, that if you talk about a new Middle East altogether, not just the Israeli-Palestinian question, then you have to look at the facts on the ground. You have to see at the young people who were in Tahrir Square, you have to see about the women, you have to see about the people who are demanding a real change. So we cannot afford, and this is probably part of the failure for the last 20 years, that we have the same people with the same agenda, although the Israeli-Palestinian question is different than the rest of the Arab world. But let me take you back to December of 1987. I was in Gaza as a reporter for Agence France Presse, and it was the Palestinian Intifada, if most of you recall that time. And the success of the first Intifada was basically because it was a civil disobedience against a military occupation. It was largely non-violent, with the exception of, throwing stones here and there and Molotov cocktail. But basically it was grandmothers standing in front of the Red Cross. It was students. It was children. Everybody had enough with Israeli military rule, and they wanted an end for it. And for the first time, the Israelis took the Palestinians seriously. And I think I will say a few years later, that led to the Madrid Conference, that Israelis tried for so many years trying to find an alternative. We don't want to talk to these Palestinians. It was a time when I was a reporter in Gaza and the West Bank, where carrying a Palestinian flag was a crime that will land you in jail. After the age of 16, as a Palestinian, you have to carry an identity card. And if you don't have it, an Israeli soldier stop you in the street, you can also be arrested or detained. And in this identity card, which is really important for you to know, it will say your name, your date of birth, your mother name, your father name, but then it says nationality, and it would fill with your religion. So it will say Christian or a Muslim. Because the word Palestinian or Palestine will get stuck in the Israelis' throat. They cannot pronounce it. So I just want to tell you how far we came now, actually, that they can sit down in front of each other and talk about how we can go forward, and whether we're talking about 67 border with the swap, or we're talking about whatever terms of reference. But I think the fact that this was the first Palestinian uprising, that was the Arab Spring. At the time when the Palestinians rose against the military occupation, it's exactly what you see now in 2010, and you saw it in Tunisia with Mohammed Bouazizi. Except that we didn't call it the Arab Spring now. And I actually like the term, the Arab Spring, and I hope we'll stick to it, because I think it's a revolt against the status quo, against one-party rule in the Arab world. And I don't know how things will turn out, but I think whatever things will shape up, it's going to be better than dictatorship and despotic regimes. So I'm happy to call it the Arab Spring. And I hope it will continue. It will go to all the neighbors and all the countries, because only democracies and only true democracies, and not just an election process, that ultimately will bring peace. You asked me about President Abbas, and I think by probably testimony of many, that President Abbas committed to nonviolence. And he believed that he's very pragmatic. And I think the reason that he resorted to go to the UN, as we all discussed since the morning of the failure of the 20 years of talks, is basically the best, I think it's been described, I've seen it as he's like the young revolutionary on an Arab street. He was fed up of being taken for granted. And this is what happened. For the last 20 years, we have seen Israeli settlements multiplying. They're taking, grabbing lands, and they're creating facts on the ground. So now we're talking about the 67 border with swaps. What are the swaps? Are the 4 big settlements block that now they are big. I mean, to call them settlements, I don't know how many of you visited the area, but they are cities with schools and kindergartens and factories and everything that qualify them to be a city. So the fact on the ground that basically land has been confiscated and you create a community there and then they become 500,000 and become 600,000 and it will be difficult to evacuate them. Then you start talking about swaps. We keep them there and we go to somewhere else. So I think it was an act of desperation because the process was not working and the Israelis create the facts on the ground and the Palestinians have to create a new reality. And that new reality, I think Nabil Sha'ad talked about it this morning, is basically to go to the international community to create some kind of dynamics. Not because if they go to UNESCO and become a member or they go to the UN Security Council and the American veto it, that ultimately it will bring them a state. They know that. I think from a Palestinian perspective, I'm talking today as a Palestinian, actually, I'm not talking as a journalist. From a Palestinian point of view, and for me as I grew up in Gaza for all my formative years under Israeli military rule, we believed in the two-state solution. There's no alternative to the two-state solution, but I agree with many that as time goes along, you feel pessimistic that you're left with very little to negotiate for.
But Nadia, to bring it back to the specifics now, I mean, yes, there were no protests, but there was discontent, and there has been discontent in the Palestinian body politic, and the Arab Spring seemed to crystallize that, and Abbas and Hamas have attempted a reconciliation deal. How effective is this? I mean, if there is to be a peace process, we do have to have a unified Palestinian body politic. So talk about the Arab Spring, the impact on that.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I agree with you. Also, the fact that President Abbas went to the UN is because of what's happening around him. That the Palestinians, who I said led the first Arab Spring, will be left behind. So he has to do something for them to show that he's doing something. Now, I always argue that there is no national movement gain liberation being divided. And Hamas and Fatah have to somehow accommodate each other. But the cynics in me, and I covered Africa for 10 years, and I always felt that the Sudanese will never sign a peace treaty, and they did. So I was wrong. That I thought Hamas and Fatah existed to cancel each other. And for the first time, you have Hamas, which is an Islamist movement, in power. So the first time, really, the Muslim Brotherhood are in power. So what is it there for them to give up power? So it was a competition. It's not a coalition government like we see in Israel, because, yes, they truly were elected fairly and squarely, but we're not 6 years in existence. So they didn't have this maneuvering of how you can build coalition and bring minorities, etc. But now the situation, and most of you know, the fact that Hamas is losing its base in Damascus, and there is domestic pressure on President Abbas, are forcing both sides to come together. And we have seen how the Egyptians mediated in the Shalit case and released him. So that will create new dynamics on the ground to make both these parties decide that in their own interest, they have to get together. And just one quick element I will add. It's not just this rapprochement between Abu Mazen and Khalid Mish'al, who's the head of Hamas in Damascus, but watch what he's doing even in Jordan, that actually Khalid Mish'al is invited back to Jordan. And you know that King Hussein at the time kicked Hamas out and they were not allowed to operate. But now he's back, he's going to be back in Jordan, and actually the new prime minister welcomed them. So this new dynamic is all created because of the Arab Spring.
Only one remark. The Zionist movement succeeded in establishing independence by a divided national movement. We were fighting one each other. The revisionism was against us, so only for the historical point of view.
Thank you. Rob, you follow the peace process very closely from the Washington perspective. I'd like to hear your thoughts about whether or not you think a democratizing Arab world really poses an opportunity for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, or makes it less likely. And what role do you think the U.S. can play, if not now, at least after the elections, in trying to encourage peace talks in this new environment?
Well, thank you very much, Kate. When you're fifth, you have a whole stock of comments you want to make, and I'm not going to miss the opportunity. First, and they all actually do connect to the question, so that's my connective thread here. First, I do want to be a bit of a contrarian just on your very opening remark about the wistful sense that we've had 20 years since Madrid and the great optimism from then, and see what has faded until now. Not that you said the word faded, but that theme has been out there. I want to offer the optimistic appraisal, certainly from an American perspective. Let us remember what the peace process is all about from the American perspective. It is, yes, it's a process to help the local parties achieve peace, but it is a process, a diplomatic process, to replace a war process, first and foremost. And if one can say anything about the last 30 plus years in the Arab-Israeli arena, in the Levant, there has been no interstate Arab-Israeli war. And Madrid helped along that process greatly. Now, we've seen some awful moments between Israelis and Palestinians, but I would argue that this, in fact, proves the point. At the worst and darkest days between Israelis and Palestinians, 4,000 Palestinian dead, 1,000 Israelis dead during the Second Intifada, not one Arab state intervened, played a role at all. Zero. This was an American achievement. We don't take it that way, but we should. Now, Madrid did not achieve its ultimate objectives, but Madrid certainly achieved its minimum objectives. And that, I think, in the Middle East is no small achievement. Look, secondly, I agree very much with the connection that Nadia made between Intifada 1 and the current events in the Middle East. In fact, I've been calling the events in the Middle East since last February Intifadat al-Arab. This is not rebellions or peace processes or revolutions. All we know so far is that they are uprisings against established authority, whose outcome is uncertain. That's all we know. Come back to me in 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, and then we'll know what they are. Revolutions, a moment in history that is but a footnote, we'll find out. All we know is that they're uprisings. Thirdly, and this will eventually connect to the American view, thirdly, I take some slight exception to, or a difference of opinion on where Egypt is going. I think what we're seeing in Egypt is the emergence of to use a European concept, of a third way. Namely, they're going back to no peace, no war. It's not just peace, have a peace treaty, or war, go start shooting. I think the Egyptian leadership and elite is drifting in a direction of experimenting with no peace, no war. A very dangerous drift, because I think it's extremely difficult to sustain. And fourth, I agree very much with the interjection that Yair made a moment ago about Palestinian politics. I know it's been a sub-theme throughout the day, the idea of unified Palestinian politics being essential for progress toward peace. I would argue the exact opposite. Just the same way that the Oslo Accords were approved by an Israeli parliament, by the Knesset, by a vote of 61 to 59. Doesn't get much closer than that. Just the same way, we will have to see Palestinian politics make a decision down the middle for peace. It will not be unified. The choices are progress or unity, not progress and unity. Now, how has the Americans reacted to all this? I think certainly since May, perhaps since February, but I think certainly since May, when President Obama gave his speech, the decision was, this is not the right time. I am going to park this process. There is just too much uncertainty, too much going on. Iraq, Afghanistan, huge uncertain change in Egypt, emerging change in Syria. I'm going to fight a war in Libya that I certainly never planned to fight. I have a broken relationship with the Saudis. The Israelis, I'm about to pull a major surprise on them. I've done all I'm going to do. And in fact, I think that's been the administration's policy. And I think it's wise. I think the chances that this administration or any administration facing what it faces in the Middle East today looks at the Arab-Israeli, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and sees opportunity over the next year, impossible. Now, what can be done between now and for the next year to make progress more likely after an election, assuming that you're the incumbent and you've been reelected? I think getting the change in Arab states right, or helping Arab states get their change right, is essential. And here I do come back to Egypt, which I do think is a very important player here. I don't think in the last several months that we have been as effective as we should be, working both in public and in private, messaging the important interests that we have with the Egyptians. Secondly, I think that we have totally lost our ability to influence Palestinian politics. The idea that the Palestinian leader has directly gone against the personal request of the President of the United States, who's threatened now consequences which he refuses to impose on several occasions, first with the settlements resolution of the Security Council over a year ago, and more recently with the UN. I think the Palestinians have decided that for all sorts of reasons, they don't have to worry about the relationship here in Washington. Perhaps the bar here is so low that they don't have to worry about meeting the bar. I think the Israelis look at the regional situation and say, there's no way we're taking risks. And I think there's an increasing sense here in Washington of understanding of that Israeli situation. And so I would say, if I was an American policymaker over the course of the next year, the best thing I can do to make progress more likely a year from now is help get Egypt in a functioning representative, operating legitimate government, and help trigger change in Syria, which I think will have strategic implications that benefit the peace process as well as many other aspects of the region.
There were many who would say that the U.S. doesn't really have a role to play in trying to help the Arabs get it right. And I'm wondering, Dan, if you'd like to jump in on this. We're looking at, we hear that the conditions are not right for Arab-Palestinian-Israeli peace process. With regard to the Arabs, do you think that the U.S. can play a role in helping them get it right in order to, and that will be a way to facilitate a peace process in the long run? In terms of getting their democracies
right? I mean, assist in the construction of functioning democracies.
Precisely.
I mean, I think we absolutely have to play a large role in that. And I think it is, depending on which context we're talking about, more or less difficult. Thus far, it has been easiest in many respects in Tunisia. There, the process is moving forward fairly smoothly, and the kind of nationalist ideology we've been talking about today, which is alive and well and has been, I think, very much fostered by the military in Egypt, is not an issue in the Tunisian context. And I think little Tunisia has been ignored. But I think a lot has to be said by one small place succeeding in providing an example of how this can be done for the region, and Libya, of course, as its neighbor. So I think that's very important. I am very concerned about the situation in Egypt. I have a somewhat less optimistic view of the role of the military there. I think that the effort by the current regime to basically undercut any efforts of the U.S. government directly or indirectly to support NGOs is a very negative development, and it's going to very much undercut our friends there. And I think we have to find a way to speak to the Egyptian authorities so they will see that ultimately this can't be simply a transition from one kind of military government to another.
But getting back to the peace process, and Graham, I want to draw you in here. Egypt has traditionally been a leader in the peace process. Today it has other concerns as it tries to construct a new government. Do you think once things stabilize there, it will try to reassert its role as a central player in the peace process, or do you think we'll see other players like Turkey trying to assert itself during this new, this vacuum in leadership?
Well, I think myself that Egypt is essential to the peace process because all subsequent peace treaties are somehow follow out of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, because if that's not in place, everything else does not matter. And that was the accomplishment in 1978 at Camp David and 79 getting to the treaty. I'm always nervous talking about those years because I see Hal Saunders and Herb Hansel here, who both were at Camp David, which makes the rest of us somewhat just talking hearsay from them. But it seems to me that the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel never evolved the way any of us had hoped it would, because both sides fell short. Now, is there a chance in the future for the Israelis and the Egyptians to begin to look at that again? I would certainly hope so. But at first, the Egyptians are focused inward. They have to address their own internal problems before they can address the external problems. They're not going to get involved with that until they solve how they're going to govern themselves. And I'd like to make one comment about the American role. I'm always amazed at this conference today. I've been surprised at how many people here are so assured that the United States has the central role that we always had in the peace process. I think that over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a huge degradation of the American influence, starting certainly with the Iraq War in the region, how unpopular that was, the economic crisis, how we discredited ourselves around the world financially, and how we've sort of abdicated a role in the leadership. Can we reassume it? Yes, but is it likely? I don't know. And what that means is people in the region are not paying as much attention to us as they used to. I think the Palestinian decision to go to the United Nations was a challenge to the parameters of what the basics for peace had been for the last 35 years. President Sadat had it correct at that time when he said the United States had 99% of the cards. But the fact was, the card that the Arabs looked to was the United States as the one who could influence Israel to make the compromises. Because of our total identity with Israeli policy over the last decade, our credibility has fallen off in that regard, and therefore people are looking elsewhere. They no longer are looking to the paradigm of a peace negotiations between the Arab world with the United States as the mediator, the midwife of any peace process. We are facing a fundamental change in our role. And when Dan says we can influence the Egyptians, please understand, our popularity rating on the streets of Egypt is 8%. I mean, we rival Congress. Its popularity ratings.
That is depressing.
It is a serious problem for the United States. And if you think somebody with an 8% popularity rating is going to influence the people in Egypt, I think you're fooling yourselves. I don't think that's going to happen. Our ability to influence events is limited today more so than any time in the last 35 years. It is a serious problem we face, and we need to think about that.
Anybody else want to? We'll take this up after. Yair, I wanted to ask you about the Israeli Arab Spring. This summer we saw a protest movement emerge that claimed to be inspired by the Arab Spring. And I'm wondering if you see any linkage between that and a possible movement in Israel toward the peace process. Some have said that, Netanyahu might, as a distraction, if the social protest movement grows, turn to the peace process. Do you think there's any linkage between the social protests and domestic discontent in Israel and a potential for a peace process in Israel?
As a distraction, he went to get Gilad Shalit home. I've seen a clear connection between the protest movement and the decision to pay the price for getting Gilad Shalit home. Because it's been absolutely popular in Israel. I don't see how with the Israeli Arab Spring, you know, it's in many ways it's different because don't want to be, but nobody shoots at us, and it is a little bit more liberal than otherwhere. But I think the decisive issue in Israel to move forwards towards a peace, on a peace track that is possible, and I have to say something about what Robert said, which I deeply disagree, is whether Netanyahu will move towards changing his government. And there are strong voices within Likud that this is necessary. And there are strong voices within Kadima that it is necessary to move towards a negotiation. And in this, the Israeli internal protest may help in this. It may do the opposite. I tell you, it helps because Tzipi Livni is weaker and she has to come to terms with Bibi. On the other side, she may be too much afraid of the opposition from the left. So it's a decision of two people. Now, where I dramatically, and this is an impact on what I'm answering you, dramatically disagree with Robert, is the assumption. There are two assumptions. The assumption is that if we have 1 year of waiting and seeing, that everything will be quiet and everything will be wonderful. This is a very dangerous illusion. And I think, and I'm sorry that I have to tell you this, because this is not my right to do that, but I believe that you deeply misread American policies. I spoke a lot to the people who are close to this administration, and what they basically are saying is we don't think we can succeed, and we hope nothing will happen, but if things explode, the Israelis will come to terms and we will move ahead. And it is a passive-aggressive position and is not out of agreement with the Israeli government. There's no agreement with the Israeli government on that. And to read into this an agreement is misunderstanding the basics of the development. No, I do agree, and we spoke before that an agreement on the peace process, on permanent status, on territory, on all of this is not in hands. But what is in hands is a very substantial agreement on the Palestinian state building process. Palestinian state building, economic development, changing realities on the ground. There is a big majority in Israel to move forward on that. And if there is a decision to change the Israeli government on that, we will move strongly forward in it. And I'm quite sure that we have my difficulty is that I'm not sure if we have a Palestinian partner. But I hope we will have a Palestinian partner, because we need a Palestinian partner on either one or two equations. If they want a top-down process, which is the end, which says we want to move forward, it needs to say, okay, on territory we'll have to come with some terms, but the two major Israeli demands, which are consensual on that Israel is the state of the Jewish people and Palestine is the state of the Palestinian people, is a basic consensual Israeli demand. And if we go to the end, this has to be understood, even if we can work out the terms. And on the refugee issues, we'll have on turn. The idea that there will have to be some settlers out and refugees into Israel is outrageous. And there will have to be agreement on the Palestinian side on the refugee issue that it says there's no right return to Israel, whatever it means, or however you form this in a language. And if the Palestinian side is not willing to do this, we'll have to have a bottom-up agreement. And on the bottom-up agreement, the equation is that there will be major steps for state building, but it cannot go together with what we call delegitimization of Israel. It has to go together with acts that will not delegitimization of Israel. And I believe if we get this input from the Palestinian side, and I'm looking to you, if we get this input from the Palestinian side, it will have an impact on the Israeli body politic, and the people within Likud, and from Likud the left, not the Liebermans of this world, not the Boogie Galons of this world, who are outside the Israeli consensus, will be, so in the end, will be neutralized or will be minimized, and we can have a government that can move forward in this way. in a positive impact on the Arab Spring.
I have a feeling Rob is going to want to respond to this, but let me just then pose my question to Rob, which comes off of Yair's comment. I mean, you said now is not the time to move forward, but we don't know what's going to emerge in the Arab world, in these emerging democracies. The governments could be more hostile to Israel. Isn't now the time for Israel to do something fresh and radical, make peace with the Palestinians, and take that away from the Arabs as an excuse?
You should ask the government of Israel, but it would seem to me that the Palestinian Authority has made a decision. And the decision is to play out the internationalism game to see how far it can take them, regardless of just to test what the costs are. How unbearable are the costs? Will it indeed trigger a total cutoff of the United States aid? Will it indeed trigger Israel to cut off X, Y, and Z, to find out what are the limits here? That's what I think Palestinian strategy is. And this is not a they wake up one morning and say, let's try this. This is a considered decision. It's been spoken about for many months that this is a decision. I don't think it's going to lead them to where they want to go, but it's their choice. I think it would be a mistake for the United States to try to beat its head against the wall and continue to try to bring together parties when one of the parties has decided that's not the route that it wants to go. We're not even talking about the details of negotiations. We're talking about the concept, the framework of negotiation. So I think discretion here is the better part of valor. It's a very wise decision by the United States to let others, in this case, whether the Quartet or whoever it is, take the lead in keeping whatever it is on a low boil. I mean, with the president, when George Mitchell resigned, the president didn't appoint another high-level Mitchell-level, political-level envoy. He appointed a very capable diplomat, but it was quite clear it was not the same level. And I think the administration made a decision. You don't see the Secretary of State taking this as her personal agenda. You certainly don't see the president taking this as his personal agenda. I think May 19th is where the president has said, that's my policy. I'm going to revisit this if I'm still around. In the end of January of 2013. And the fact that the regional situation may be worse between now and January 2013, I think the assessment of the administration says it only adds to that idea that it doesn't make sense to try to do it now, that any investment in this effort may even come apart because the regional situation may be worse. And then you end up with a more Bill Clinton-ish, how you end your term with muck on your hands rather than the success that you hoped for.
Can I just add 2 points? Number one, actually, I agree with Graham. I think the American prestige and stand in the Middle East has been damaged. And I was with President Obama in Cairo when he gave his speech, and I think at that time he couldn't do anything wrong in many of the people's eyes. The people were crying. And 2 years later, and I think the United States popularity in Egypt, I read even some 3%, not just even 8%. It's gone down probably. And in Turkey, by the way, and many other Arab countries, not just in Egypt. But I think I disagree with Rob. I mean, I talked before about the decision to go to the UN and why President Abbas took it. But I think it was not just taken overnight. It was a process. President Obama came in the first day and he said, I'm going to appoint an envoy, and that was George Mitchell. And I'm not going to leave it till the last year like the Bush administration. I'm going to start now. And then this exercise was futile. It didn't lead to anything. And the President Obama demanded from the Israelis to freeze the settlements, and they refused. So they're the one who defined the United States president. It's not the Palestinians. They were going along. And what the president did, he turned to the weaker side, which is the Palestinian, and he said, well, you have to accept now to come into a face-to-face negotiation, direct negotiation. So I don't think, we're not here obviously it's easy to talk about who's to blame, but I think the fact that it came out of a vacuum that go to the UN, but it was a process that started for a while. It didn't work for almost 2 years, and it was left out of desperation because there was nothing else to do. And I keep saying that the Palestinians know very well that going to the UN is not going to create a state tomorrow, and it's not going to free East Jerusalem, and it's not going to return the refugees, and it's not going to remove the settlements. But it's a card that's going to play for the first time ever. Everybody was telling President Abbas, don't go to the UN. Don't go. Whatever, don't go. So basically, I mean, he's turning the table around and said, okay, all the other options failed, and I have one card to play, and I'm going to play it. And now to see something like a small organization like UNESCO with 107 countries supporting it, and Washington saying, well, these people it's undermining the peace process and undermining the international community. But the international community are voting with the Palestinians. So you have to create this new dynamics to start a new process. And I think the definition of madness is trying the same thing twice and expecting different results.
All right, we're running out of time here. We want to move to questions. But very quickly, I want to give the other panelists a chance to wrap up or comment. 1 minute.
Just the last 3 comments remind us that how easily this discussion glides into a discussion of the Arab-Israeli conflict and our perceptions of it. It's almost impossible. I spent my career avoiding this issue because it's, precisely because it's become so entangled and so irretractable. It's discouraging in that sense, but we have very different perspectives on this. But this discussion is about democratization, the Arab Spring, and the peace conflict. And I think on that issue, I would simply say this. We are talking about a process of political change. Rob's absolutely right. We don't know where it's going in many of these countries. But if there's going to be democratization, the assumption that there can be democratization in the absence of a successful Arab-Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking process, I think is misplaced. Peacemaking between the Israelis and the Palestinians, if it were successful, would greatly facilitate democratization in the region. And I think that's a simple, and yes, less so, it's an issue, as I said, less so in Tunisia, more so in Egypt and Jordan. But I think this issue, as long as it remains unresolved, is going to become an obstacle to sustained democratization in the region.
Yep, a real sore in the Arab psyche. Graham, quickly.
I just want to say that what's going on in the Middle East is not the American Revolution, not the French Revolution. It's the people in the region. And I think in Egypt, it's the Egyptian Revolution, and they're going to do it their own way. And the more the United States tries to get into it, the less popular we're going to be. Let them do their thing, support them where we can. But in the end, it's their countries and their revolution that'll do what's best for their countries.
Nadia, very briefly.
I will say that the Palestinian issue is part of in the print of the DNA of the Arab psyche. Yes, we have not seen people in Tahrir Square burning Israelis and American flags, but trust me, it is the personal struggle for them is to change their own government and to have somebody who treat them as equal citizens in their own country. But the Palestinian issue will always be part of the bigger Arabic issue. And Israel can never have peace without a just solution to the Israeli-Palestinian question. They can negotiate with whoever they want, but the peace has to come first with the Palestinians, and then it will go out with the rest of the Arab world.
Yeah, Yair, please.
I have much to say, but the issue with if you want to speak about democratization in the Arab world, I'm not sure that we will fully agree on what you say. Is that how do you keep this away from inflaming the Israeli-Arab peace process? And it all too easily can spill over into more flames and more disaster. And on doing this, from my point of view, you have got 3 possibilities on the Israeli-Palestinian level beyond the bottom-up or top-down. You have the possibility to punish the Palestinians for going to the United Nations on doing this and get in return the Hamas and more violence and more things, which is a brilliant idea, particularly if you sit here and your grandchildren are here and not at home. I've got 7 grandchildren in my place and I care a little bit about it. The second option is to say, okay, this is wonderful and go ahead and make whatever you want, which I think is also not a very good idea. And the third option is to say there are conditions. There are conditions, and there are three dramatic conditions. Condition number one is that we will speak very serious about security, and then it's not only Palestinian contributing to security, but it is the Saudis, it is the Jordanians, it is the Egyptians taking care that there will be major activities done in order to prevent terror and violence against Israelis. And the solution is a Security Council solution 1373. The second condition is that we immediately go back to negotiations, and the third condition is that we take care of agreements. And this would be a constructive position. And American leadership could get this done because you've got a majority in Israel who wants to go along to this. If this is not be done because some kind of ignorance, the truth is Obama's position, what he's doing is only looking at November 2012 and not about the substance in itself. And it's quite a tragedy for all of us.
Thank you. Rob.
Let me be a bit telegraphic. If you're an American strategist, you see the Middle East with four pillars of American influence: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. Recent events have worsened our relationships with Egypt and with Saudi Arabia. Turkey is a huge question mark, and Israel has great uncertainty about where America is going more generally. And Israel's overall relationship with the United States, while perhaps better today than a year ago, is worse today than 5 years ago. So if you're the United States, you want to, I think, repair your relationships. And then the potential for peacemaking becomes much more real.
Thank you. All right, we've got about 25 minutes left for questions. I think we'll take 3 at a time, and the panelists will answer accordingly. I'd like everybody to keep their questions to just one question, please, one question per person, and please state your name and affiliation. We'll start with you first, gentleman in the blue. Somebody behind you. If you could, we'll bring the microphone to you next.
My name is Said Erikat from the Quartet Daily newspaper. And my question pertains to a point that Secretary of State Baker raised this morning. He warned that the Arab Spring can turn into an Arab winter, and the uprising that is taking place in Egypt and other places will move from being local and towards the Arab-Israeli issue. So I'd like to hear the panel's take on that. How will that affect the dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict? And to Mr. Hirschfeld, very quickly, you said that the Israelis do not shoot at us when we protest. Will they shoot at the Palestinians when they begin to march in the tens of thousands on the settlements sometimes in the near future?
Thank you. Next question, please. The gentleman down here in the blue tie. Yep, he's bringing the mic.
I'm Joe Burdecki with Bernstein Global Wealth Management. And I'd like a little bit of a more perspective on Turkey and Turkey's possible role and what's happening there and how it will affect the process.
Thank you. And there's a gentleman who had his hand up back here, the gentleman with the, right here.
Hi, Omar Farouk. I just had a question for Mr. Hirschfeld. You mentioned that the idea that Israel is a Jewish state is non-negotiable. And I was wondering, what exactly does Israel gain from identifying itself as a Jewish state? Is it because, does it gain some ability to enact certain laws internally? Because it just seems really problematic to call itself a Jewish state. And then for all these...
I didn't say Israel is a Jewish state. I said Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. By the way, I used the language that is the national home of the Jewish people. I used, by the way, the language that the Prime Minister used. I can answer to you more. Don't change the words.
I understand. But don't you think it's a little problematic diplomatically if a lot of the extremely important Jewish sites are in areas outside of, what most Palestinians would see as an Israeli state? So.
Thank you. Who wants to take Arab Spring to Arab Winter? We'll respond to the fellow third, and then we'll do Israel, and we'll do Years at the end.
Well, I mean, very, very quickly, I think that if there is a major outbreak of hostilities between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza, for example, and this is sustained over time, there's no doubt about it, particularly in the case of Egypt, that radical Islamists will exploit this, and this will be used to advance their cause and to assail the government, and this will be destabilizing. I think there's no question about it, and I think that if the Secretary of State had Egypt in mind, that's one place where we'd have to be deeply worried precisely about that drift to an Arab winter. If we can keep a cap on the possibility of conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it's less so. But under those conditions, I think you're going to find that the situation could become problematic in Egypt.
Who wants to take Turkey?
I can also take Turkey if you want. I believe that Israeli and Turkish interests, strategic interests, are parallel to each other. Turkey can only play a constructive role in the Middle East if it thrives in stability. And if Turkey contributes to instability, to destabilizing, which it has done in the last 2 years, it is a very dangerous course, which the Prime Minister may lead, but you have got the diplomatic community, the business community, the military community, that all think that a different course would be more effective. Also, you have obviously some populists who think this is a good idea. And I think we should have far more discussions with Turkey how to go along with. The truth is that we had an agreement only to solve this flotilla thing. There was an understanding. We have a Minister of Foreign Affairs and a Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs who's undermined this. We have on the Turkish side no easy partner, the Prime Minister. But Turkish-Israeli relations can be put back together into some more structural ways, and probably with a carrot and with a stick with both sides. If I go to the other, can I go to the other questions?
Let's just finish Turkey first, because I think there's some other comments about Turkey.
Just on Turkey, I think I wish that were true. I think it's a little bit more difficult. I think that U.S.
I know the details.
Let me finish the point. I think that U.S.-Turkish relations, I think the administration right now is trying to thread the needle in such a way that it can salvage U.S.-Turkish relations while recognizing that Turkish-Israeli relations are going to be in a difficult period for quite some time. Not just because of the IHH or not just because of the flotilla, but because of Erdogan made a strategic decision that for domestic political reasons it helps him and it's a cost worthy to bear that, to have an injured Turkish-Israeli relation. But the administration is looking to Turkey to play a very important and contributing role on Syria, on Iran, on all sorts of things. And so this is a very delicate tactic for the strategy for the administration, trying to maintain a constructive relationship with Turkey at a moment when the Turks are quite hell-bent on having a negative relationship with Israel.
Well, they certainly played a constructive role in 2008 when they, sought to mediate talks between Syria and Israel. I'm wondering today, Nadia, do you want to comment on Turkey and the future role it might play?
I just wanted to pick up on the first question. I don't really see a third violent intifada, partly because as long as the PA is there and they took this strategic decision of not to be violent, but I can see a mass movement of people going to the checkpoints and probably to the settlements, and this up to the Israelis how they're going to react to that against civilian population. In Gaza in particular, we have seen every time there is some kind of tension that can develop into something serious, you see the Egyptians coming quickly and mediating, as we have seen in the last few days. So even when you have people who, not really Hamas, but the Hamas trying to control and they couldn't, and they firing rockets, somehow there is a third party involved and trying to deflate the tension there. On Turkey is always trying to play a regional power. And I think the emergence of Prime Minister Erdogan and his Islamist party as the model that we keep talking about it to generations of Arabs, basically for the lack of having our own leaders, that Erdogan emerged really as somebody admirable. And his stance towards the Palestinian in particular, I think, has won him great support in the Arab world and among the Palestinians. But Turkey has played a traditional role in the past in terms of mediation with Syria. Now the situation is completely unpredictable and precarious. We don't know how Syria is going to turn and what kind of system we're going to have. And that relationship is going to be affected with Turkey, Turkey's relationship with Iraq as well, and the Kurds. And all these, it's very, very complicated, and how one conflict will affect the other. And, his stance against the Assad regime in Syria might affect the Kurds in northern Iraq as well. So, and his relationship with Israel, of course, except for this goodwill that we have seen in the last few days in terms of the earthquake and the Israeli help. But otherwise, it's been a very tense and contentious relationship.
Yair, do you want to address the young gentleman's question?
There were two questions which I haven't answered. The one is, will Israelis shoot at demonstrators? And the short answer that I have, and I'll make it a little bit longer than short, is I'm afraid it cannot be prevented. And I'll tell you an experience we had in 2001 after the Intifada was there. We had close cooperation with the Palestinian side in Jenin, and there was an understanding. There was a demonstration there where the IDF and the Palestinian security forces worked together in controlling the demonstration. And because they worked together, they didn't see that the demonstration got very close to the two settlements that were there. They're not there anymore, Ghanim and Kadim. And somebody, we don't know who, lost control, and somebody started to shoot at the other side. In the end, there were dead people on both sides. And with all the best will on the Palestinian Authority side, I don't see how if Israeli soldiers are under pressure and being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed by 8,000, 10,000 people, it can, like this, turn into violence. And therefore, I'm not so sure if we can have an intifada that will not be violent. And therefore I see a very, very dangerous way down the way to very, very serious violence down the road. And this is one reason why I don't think we have 1 year time to simply wait until there will be new elections in the United States. On the Jewish state issue, if you want a two-state solution, if you're serious about a two-state solution, it means that Israel is a state where the Jewish people in agreed borders exercise their right to self-determination with full equal civilian, not national, with full equal civilian rights to the Israeli Arab population. And we give them almost full equal civilian rights, and I will fight for more, but not for national rights. The Palestinians have their national rights in the Palestinian state, and I would see it very positively if in the Palestinian state there could be equal rights for Jews who would stay there, which I'm not sure we have to demand. I don't know if this is out there. But definitely to say Palestine is the state of the Palestinian people and Israel is the state of the Jewish and the Palestinian people, forget it. That's not a two-state solution. So the answer is yes. A two-state solution means Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, Palestine is the homeland of the Palestinian people. Now, on the last remark you made, it is important, because in the end you will have Palestinians who will say this belongs to me, and you will have Israelis say our homeland is in Shechem and these places. And in the end, this formula will serve both sides and actually in the national interest of both sides.
Thank you. Let's get back to the Arab Spring. The gentleman with the striped tie.
Yes, thank you. My name is Tyler Mesha. I'm a student at American University. I'm often been heard a lot throughout the different conferences, panels today, kind of like almost a lamenting of the fact that the U.S. has lost its prestige in the Arab world, it's lost its influence, and it doesn't really have the weight that it used to have. But at the same token, I also see this as an opportunity, as perhaps internationalizing the peace process a little bit more, bringing in more parties, maybe like Turkey, maybe more nations like France, Germany, Spain, whoever. But at the end of the day, because ultimately it doesn't really matter from a policy standpoint. If the objective is peace, who cares if it's a peace brokered and backed by the United States or brokered and backed by Europe? Peace is peace.
Thank you. The gentleman just below.
Yes, Fred Lazen from Ben Gurion University and American University. I wanted to ask Nadia a question. You referred to yourself as a Palestinian. You're also a woman. With the Arab Spring, do you have any concern at all about what might eventually happen to the status of women in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya? And to the other members of the panel, I would just ask, is the Palestinian-Israeli issue for the Arab Spring more important than the issue of Islam?
And a third question. There's a gentleman up here with his hand up.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Morgenstein. And with the wave of democratization, or I guess uprisings, going through a number of countries throughout the Arab world, earlier in the year, we saw some nascent protests within Gaza itself, and I think a little bit less on the West Bank. To what degree do you think those kinds of uprisings may or may not grow or reemerge within Gaza against the Hamas governance and against the Palestinian Authority? And what role might that play in the future of negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians?
Great. Who would like to take the multilateralism question?
I mean, sorry, right. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, just on that very interesting question, does it matter whether it's America, Europe, Micronesia, the Solomon Islands, or whoever is the peace broker? The answer is yes. Yes, it does. It matters because one of the main roles of the broker is to reduce the risks that the parties have to make their concessions. And not everybody can reduce these risks. There are different ways to reduce risks. One is by strengthening the party militarily, politically, economically. The other is to defeat the parties that pose risks, whether it's Iran, rejectionists, Al Qaeda, whoever. It's a very serious job, and at the moment, I don't think any of the regional parties. It's not my own personal assessment. I don't think any of the regional parties see that there's a third actor out there. The Chinese, the Russians, that's going to play the constructive role of reducing the risks and making the environment conducive to peace. Doesn't mean they can lead them to water, but they can help ensure that there's some water there eventually if they want to drink it.
Graham, do you want to respond? Nadia?
Yeah, I just wanted to add this. Yes, it's important. And the United States, the reason that from a Palestinian perspective, why it's important. Otherwise, it could be done a long time ago without the U.S. The other parties, the UN and the EU, can play a supportive role. It's because the United States sees itself as a true friend of Israel, and therefore they have leverage over them. So if there is anything need to be going forward in the peace process and you need concession from the Israelis, the American can do it. And going back to Secretary Baker, this is what they did in George Bush, the father, administration. They're trying to hold the loan guarantees. So if you don't freeze settlements, we'll do this or that. So this is why the United States is really important.
Do you want to address the women in Arab Spring?
Oh, the women, yes. I'm not actually worried at all about the status of women in the Middle East. I actually worried about continuing under one-party rule and living under dictatorship. Because being free, you have to be living in a democratic society. And I'm optimistic, and I hope I will be proven right in the end, that ultimately, when you have a democracy, and I don't know why people are impatient, it takes time. It takes a decade or maybe two, but we're willing to take that risk. Look at Latin America. It was not a democracy overnight. So when everybody said, look at Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and Yemen, and it's very chaotic, and we don't know, and the Islamists are taking over, that will be our battle. But let there be a true movement towards a change that will fundamentally give us something that we didn't have in the last 30 and 40 years, that our dignity was taken away from us. And I'm talking about whether you live in under military occupation or you live in a dictatorship in any of the Arab countries. So unfortunately, secular regimes who happen to be dictators always somehow elevate the status of women. And we have seen this in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. You've seen it under Zain Abidine bin Ali in Tunisia and elsewhere. So these people, we don't know who they are, but I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. And when they stand against women's rights, it is up to the women in the Middle East. And believe me, they are very strong. And we have seen it in Yemen in particular, when we have Tawakkul Karman, who's leading a movement standing there against the military and not demanding women's rights, but she demanding a fundamental right for everybody. So we hold these people accountable, and I'm not really worried about our future.
Can I have a short answer? First of all, to my greatest astonishment, I agree with every word that Robert said on this.
Could you say that again? I don't think they heard it in the back.
But to the question of Palestinian, do they prefer the Islam or the Palestinian issue? The pattern is that the Islamists who are not nationalists, who don't want a two-state solution, that play up the Palestinian and Israeli thing in order to strengthen the case. And it's not either or, but it is the one using the other.
I want to follow up on what this first gentleman said and ask Graham. He mentioned that throughout the course of the conference he's been hearing that the U.S. is losing its influence and prestige in the Middle East. And I'd like to know, from your perspective as somebody who's worked in the State Department, if you think there's any solution to this, if you see this changing.
Well, I don't think it's an issue of the State Department. You want to know the truth? I mean, I think this is much broader. I think, you can't dismiss how important 2008 was and the destruction of the economic situation around the world because of America. I mean, it is seen as generally our increased greed here at home, or through these strange economic instruments, we brought the whole world economy down. That's had a terrible impact upon our standing in the world. The fact that you have things like American businessmen go to China today, and they don't even talk about the United States anymore. The Chinese are talking about doing business with Europe and with Africa and with Asia, and we're not in the conversation. The fact that you have a Greek financial crisis and we are at least a tertiary player, we're not even secondaries in these crises, it's a serious problem for us, not just on the peace process, but worldwide. It's not the State Department that can handle it.
No, I was just saying from your perspective as a State Department.
It makes everything more difficult. I'd like to make one comment. The one we didn't answer was on the, please, if I correct me if I'm wrong, but the question of the demonstrations in Gaza and the West Bank and the Arab Spring is a totally different situation there. You don't have an Arab government that controls it. You have areas that are still de facto under occupation. And therefore, what I saw in the demonstrations was frustration of the people that you had the division between Hamas and the PA, and they wanted the two to work together. And I think part of the reconciliation talks you began to see was a direct response of both Hamas and the PA to the will of the people. So it's positive in that sense.
There was actually a movement on Facebook during when Facebook was playing an important role in all the social media in mobilizing the Arab youth. There was a movement demanding the end of division between Fatah and Hamas, and people wanted them to get together.
The gentleman asked the question about the role of Turkey, and it's very unfortunate that the Turkish foreign policy and regional policy is involved the way it has, in part because Turkey cannot play the kind of role in at least assisting in the mediation of the Arab-Israeli conflict that it might otherwise have. Erdogan's kind of populism and his statements have certainly undercut Turkey's capacity to do that. But having said that, and here I'm going to try to get back to the democracy issue once again, the notion that Erdogan can undertake a foreign policy that doesn't take into account the sentiments of the Turkish people, or that the Turkish people will not be influenced by what happens on the Palestinian Gaza-Israeli border, of course, is ludicrous. I don't agree with the assumption that Turkey has taken a strategic decision and that the drift in Turkish foreign policy was at all inevitable. The hypothesis that it was can only be proven under the conditions in which there is an evolving, successful Palestinian-Israeli peace process that demonstrates that the outcome will be a two-state solution. When there's precisely the opposite, you can be sure that popular opinion in Turkey will be energized, and of course this will be used, manipulated, or otherwise deployed by the Turkish government, Erdogan, or any leader to increase his popularity both at home and in the region. So I once again get back to this question of a dynamic, and we do not know how democracy would evolve in the region under conditions of a successful peace process. We do know how it evolves in the absence of such a peace process.
All right, we started a little bit late. Hopefully we can go. Can we go two, 3 more minutes, or do we need to wrap up? Can we take 2, 3 more questions? Individual here, Phil, one question here, and we'll just take 2 more.
Hi, Phil Frayne, Middle East Institute. I'd like to ask Rob, because you have a background in Jordan. Nobody's mentioned Jordan. But I'm wondering, is the monarchy, you think, at all in danger in Jordan? They've had protests. They're frustrated, not very large ones. We haven't seen 500,000 people or anything. But because if the Jordanian monarchy fell, having lived there myself, I can tell you that people are very against the peace treaty that Jordan has with Israel. Thanks.
Just one more, because I recall that Rob has to go. One last question. This lady in the front here.
Same domestic constraints.
Hi, Jennifer Kuiper from 3P Human Security. And I had a question, I think, for Dr. Hirschfeld, but if others want to respond. I'm very intrigued about the Oslo Channel, which hasn't really been discussed, given there is a relationship to the Madrid process between the two. Given the topic of this panel, are there any back channels from any of the countries in the region or Europe or a non-U.S., given that formal negotiations seem to be less than optimistic.
All right, Jordan and Oslo.
Oslo, give me 4 hours, I will tell you.
But keep it brief. Just under a minute each.
Under a minute. There, of course, there's a dialogue going on all kind of levels. But it's not like the Oslo Channel. The Oslo Channel was a back channel. It was led by Rabin and by Peres. I was out there developing a concept, and then Rabin took the decision to move ahead on this channel, change the concept. We don't have that situation today.
On Jordan, I think generally we have a too sanguine a sense about the situation inside Jordan. The Jordanian leadership does a very good job of projecting two things. One, internal stability, and two, the idea that things are a lot worse elsewhere than they are here. And I think that, in fact, we could be surprised at the level of uncertainty on the domestic situation. I'll give you one little aspect of this. In Jordan, the word reform means something very different depending on who and what you are. You know, if you're in Egypt or somewhere else, reform means democracy, openness, competence, end of corruption. There's a general sense of what reform means. In Jordan, it depends if you're a Palestinian or an East Jordanian. If you're a Palestinian, reform means all those other things I just mentioned. If you're an East Jordanian, reform means the Palestinians have too many rights. We have too much democracy. Palestinians have too much control of the economy. Reform means we want more role in the government sector. We want a bigger government sector, not a less government sector. We want more role. It means totally different things depending on who you are. And so the job of the king is to balance these two very different definitions of the word, let alone actually implement change. And it is a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think that we should take a much closer look at his success at being able to do it.
Does anybody else want to comment on Jordan or Oslo? Well, I want to thank our excellent panelists, and thank you all for joining us. It's been a fascinating spring, summer, and fall, and we'll be watching developments closely. Thank you all so much.